Hi, everybody. I'm Dixon,
And I'm Jose.
and welcome to the February 2022 episode of Southwest Side Stories. All right, so we've got a pretty good episode today. I'm really excited to talk to Ismael Cuevas, who grew up in Scottsdale and has a really interesting story to share. It's a story that I wasn't familiar with, but it has to do with a school integration fight that happened in the late 1970s, in 1977 specifically, around some schools in the Scottsdale and Ashburn neighborhoods. There was an effort on the part of the city, as part of a nationwide effort to integrate public schools. There was a busing program that was put into place, and a lot of white parents in the neighborhood were up in arms about it. And apparently, it was a big local and national story as well, but it's sort of been forgotten to history at this point. So we're going to dig into that. Jose, what are you interested in hearing about from this interview?
I'm really intrigued to hear more of the details that Ishmael has to share. I live in the Clearing neighborhood by Garfield Bridge, by the Midway area, and like at the local pharmacy or at shops, you would find like picture black and white photograph books from the Chicago Historical Society about this neighborhood and how it's changed throughout the century. And not every Chicago neighborhood has that or has that like micro encapsulation of its history, and sometimes for good reason. They don't necessarily want that history brought up. And to your point, this is very recent history that I don't know anything about. So I'd be very curious to see how Ishmael sees that you know that history fitting into where he hopes Scottsdale is going to be heading towards, in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point, and I think in a lot of ways, a lot of people in Chicago may not be super familiar, or even on the Southwest Side, super familiar with Ashburn and Scottsdale. It's sort of tucked away as a lot of our neighborhoods are. So interested in hearing more about that. And you raise a really good point about the fact that this is recent history. It was 3 years before I was born. Um, a lot of times when people talk about school integration, they talk about, Brown versus the Board of Education and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And this is much more recent than that. And there are things in the article. We'll put a link to the article in the description. It's really good. I recommend that people read it. But there are things in the article that I think you will recognize as taking place subsequent to 1977, echoes that are happening up to the present day. So definitely something to dig into and learn from.
So my name is Ismael Cuevas. I grew up in the Scottsdale neighborhood. Um, we were actually one of the first few Mexican families who moved there on Costner Avenue, right by Stevenson Elementary, back in 1997. So, 20 years before we moved in, or from today's date, actually 45 years ago, um, the beast of ignorance roamed the streets of Ashburn and Scottsdale. The same blocks that I grew up in, the same era that I, played in the fields. I played in the school with my friends. There was a very horrific demonstrations against the integration of Black students in 8 public schools, including Stevenson Elementary and also Bogan High School, right there on 79th and Pulaski. It was it's a really sad story to see how uh, parents who lived in the Scottsdale and the Ashburn neighborhood were working to stop Black students from other parts of the Southwest side and South side from coming into the schools in the area. What was really important for me was to figure out how to tell a story that hasn't been told. I grew up in Scottsdale, as I said, and never once did I hear of this particular summer in 1977. So I wanted to look. I wanted to find information on Scottsdale. And I was writing kind of like the history of the neighborhood. And finally, after doing a lot of digging, going through the archives, going through the various libraries that we have in the city, I finally found some information that can lead this. And yeah, that's how I ultimately ended up writing the story of what happened with those with the black families who were ultimately crucial in integrating the schools in Scottsdale and Ashburn, such as Stevenson and Bowman.
Yeah. So you said you didn't know about this story growing up. You never heard about it from your neighbors or from family or anybody in the school community. How did you first hear about it? Like, and what was your first exposure to it?
Yeah, so you know what? When I was growing up, yeah, I was. It was always very kind of like I always knew because people would make comments whether I was in elementary school or just like on the block. Whether I was playing in Rainy Park or Scottsdale Park or Durkin Park. People would say, "Oh, well, this neighborhood used to be all white. And this neighborhood used to, it didn't have as many Latino families or Black families or Arab families like the way it had, in the late '90s when we got there." And I know that in school I did hear things like, the Southwest side was or did have issues of integration, right? And I think the most nearest example in proximity to Scottsdale was actually in Marquette Park. In Marquette Park in 1966, Reverend Martin Luther King actually held a march there for to integrate housing at the time. And he actually was met by a violent mob of white supremacists from the south side of Chicago, but all over the Chicagoland area. And he actually called it one of the worst scenes of his life. He actually said he's never felt that type of racism, even in the South. And as he came to Chicago. So I knew that there was things that happened in Marquette Park. There was also integration issues in the Gage Park community, but in the Scottsdale Ashburn community, it wasn't. Um, I guess it wasn't at the forefront. And so um, I literally just would go on different archives. Literally, I spent time on like JSTOR, ProQuest. These are like online databases, um, newspaper databases, and kind of just like typed in Scottsdale, typed in Ashburn, typed in Bogan, typed in Stevenson, and like looked in the '90s and looked in the '80s and in the '70s, and finally in the '70s I found like this like time period, 1977, of like searches that kept coming up for Bogan, Stevenson, and Scottsdale, and that's kind of how I found out. Like once I started pulling out all the articles of how this like story that was happening of parents fiercely opposed to having integration in the schools.
I think when a lot of people think about school integration and civil rights in general, like they think of the 50s and 60s, right? But in the 70s and even in the late 70s, like busing was a big issue in terms of that effort to try to integrate schools across the country. So can you describe like what was the busing program that the city of Chicago put into place?
So essentially, the busing program in Chicago basically was to alleviate overcrowding in predominantly black schools, or just in schools in general. But the schools that were the most overcrowded were schools in black neighborhoods. And so what parents were demanding was to alleviate overcrowding. And so what was the response from the Chicago Board of Education, Chicago Public Schools, was to alleviate this overcrowding of classrooms by busing students from one school to a school that was less crowded. So in this case, schools in black neighborhoods were more crowded, and the only other option was to bus students from a into a less crowded school, which is almost always in a predominantly white neighborhood. So, for example, in the article, I talk about schools um, on the south side of Chicago, or like kind of like in the East Ashburn part of the neighborhood that were overcrowded, and or even like in Auburn Gresham, I talk about that those schools were crowded. So kids from the Auburn Gresham community were going to get bused or had the ability to get bused to Stevenson and Dawes and other schools in the area. And so, and that was this busing strategy was not just local to Chicago. I want to reiterate that this was actually a strategy that was happening nationwide, and it was especially kind of eye opening in northern schools. There's actually a book by this author, Matthew Delmont. Why it's called "Why Busing Failed: Race, Me, and the National Resistance to School Desegregation." Um, and basically, it talks about the way that other northern cities, besides Chicago, were having this issue where predominantly white neighborhoods were against the integration of black students into the schools. And you can just imagine the all the racial language, all the um, segregationist views that people were having, like in Michigan and Boston. I mean, the book really does do a good job in highlighting that.
Yeah. Yeah. So you talked about, there were predominantly black schools that were suffering from overcrowding. I think in your article you cite some parents who said that their children were in a class of 60, and there were white schools, predominantly white schools, that had unused space. So can you describe a little bit of like, what brought that dynamic into play? Was it disinvestment in schools in predominantly black neighborhoods? Was it white flight? Like, what was going on that caused that to be the case?
It was definitely, what was happening at the time as well is, there is an issue of crowding that's happening in neighborhoods, and in the crowding, there's a lot of issues that are happening. One, there's disinvestment in the public school system, specifically in black neighborhoods, and so the schools have disinvestment. I also want to reiterate that because of the housing issue that was happening, where um, black families didn't have equal access to gain loans to buy homes in certain neighborhoods. Neighborhoods where so essentially density in black neighborhoods where it was increasing. And so with the density increasing in neighborhoods, right, you have more density in the school system. So there was a plethora of factors that were there that up to this, right? And then, for example, in schools like Stevenson in the Scottsdale neighborhood is mainly single family homes, and so population density in some of these schools were just going to be way less. Um,
Hmm.
and so there was just more room in some of those in schools to accept students. So that was kind of like some of the dynamics that were happening that informed why CPS and local government officials wanted to use buses.
Yeah. And you talk about, the school that the students would be coming from to come to Stevenson and Bogan were not too far geographically, right? They're just a little bit to the east of Scottsdale and Ashburn.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I traced down the path. It's schools that were. I mean, it's basically you took the bus down 79th Street, from Marvin Gresham. So in other schools, so it was a 15-minute bus ride at most. So it wasn't uh, completely far away. But Chicago being one of the most segregated cities in the country, 1 mile can make a big difference in how your neighborhood looks like. I give an example where there's a packed room of like over 200 parents at a Bogan meeting, and essentially parents from all over the Scottsdale and Ashburn community came to figure out a strategy to block uh, integration of the schools in the area, and parents acted on that. Right, I talk about leading up to the few weeks right before first day of school in 1977. I mean, parents were writing letters to the mayor, writing letters to the governor. As soon as they were able to get a reporter there, they would just let them know that uh, black students were not welcome in the area, and so that was one of the most I guess, crazy parts of this story, right? Just how virulent the racism was and how out there it was. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't something that was whispered. It was out in the public in the public discourse.
Yeah, and one of the really infuriating things was, they're going through kind of existing groups, civic associations and PTAs and things like that. It seems like there were new groups that were popping up as well. And like you said, the racism of the appeal that they don't want black students in the neighborhood really seemed to galvanize a lot of people. So, what were some of the other things that these groups and parents and people in the neighborhood were doing during the summer of 1977? Because it seems like they were effective to an extent, at least, and they were organized. They got a lot of attention. What are some of the other things that they were doing?
There was like I was telling some of these, it was really uh, uh, kind of eye opening again. And it is actually a quote that I found from another from a recently published book from Diane Danz. She wrote a book called "Crossing Segregated Boundaries: Remembering Chicago School Desegregation," and she makes a point in there about how the anti-busing boycott symbolized the desire to maintain segregation and to reaffirm racial boundaries, right? Um, and they talked about busing, right? We're anti-busing. So busing was kind of symbolic to keep their desires of having uh, black students out of their neighborhood. So it was interesting how these families were in these neighborhoods of the area were using busing as coded language for like we don't want integration. Um, but the other point that I wanted to make in this is that it, when these parents were organizing, they were actually copying a lot of tactics from Black freedom fighters. Um, for example, blocking streets. There's a picture that I found on in the Tribune or the Sometimes, I forgot which newspaper article, that it's literally a group of white mothers there who are blocking the intersection of 79th and Costner, and they're blocking it all. They're all linked together, right? And so it's like tactics that they borrowed from Black freedom fighters. In this case, being used for the total opposite, right? For blocking the uh, essentially the civil rights of Black students, right? And so I thought that was really um, grotesque in a sense to see that happening in the far southwest side of Chicago.
So I want to talk about what happened once the school year started. We talked about everything that was going on during the summer, and you talked about some things that were happening in terms of people being fairly militantly anti-integration. So the school year starts just after Labor Day, 1977. What happens then?
Yeah, so that's when the bubble burst, if that makes any sense. Uh, the first day of school, parents were blocking buses on 79th on Costner, and you can see in the picture that I have in the article. I mean, it's hundreds of people are there, right? Um, Jesse Jackson, through Operation Push, is actually drove to Barton Elementary, which is in the Auburn Gresham community, picked up students. There was a CTA bus with black students as well, and they were being trailed by police officers. And we're literally escorting 27 black students and one white student from Auburn Gresham to Stevenson. And so when Jesse Jackson and the school bus with the other 27 students got to Stevenson, on Costner there is literally a line of riot police, kind of blocking or protecting or separating, the uh, segregationists from the black students coming into Stevenson. And so those images are really mind blowing to see them that this is happening in our own Southwest Side community. Um, and the posters that you see some of these parents and young folks holding up, you know, with all those racial slurs that you can imagine of the time period, are just plastered all along Costner on 79th. Um, the following day, there's and the parents are just kind of like the white parents are adamant that they're not going to integrate, and so the entire week there's different actions. Um, One of the most horrifying for me is thinking about this action that the Boeing Community Council had the following week of the first day of school. There was about 1,000 people who attended a protest near Bogan, and they were marching with torches. Uh, Basically, you know, there to protest integration, right? To highlight white supremacy, and on Sunday night and Pulaski, and people were also arrested that day. I mean, there were 4 people who were seriously injured when there were when white supremacists were throwing rocks at drivers who were black in their cars. And so that was a very horrifying thing to read. Um, I talk about the example of the parents blocking the streets. I mean, they weren't allowing the school buses to pass to take students to Stevenson. So that was really uh, it's hurtful to see that. Now the following week after the first day of school, there was 500 students from Bogan. And remember, at this time, Bogan is a predominantly white school. So 500 students held the largest school protest against school integration. Even though these kids were arrested with suspension for walking out of school, the New York Times actually picked this up, so you can probably find that. They were throwing rocks. Police officers had to arrest the students. And one of the most sad and heartbreaking parts of this story that I found was the story of Joe and Helen Turner's daughter, Melanie Turner. So she was a 7-year-old student. She's participating in the busing program to go to Stevenson, and she ended up becoming a victim of racial terror. So on the day that she's getting bused from her school to Stevenson, there's dozens of white folks outside of Stevenson yelling, go back, go back, go back to where you belong, in all the racial slurs that I'm telling you that the people were saying. And so it turns out that around 10 a.m., the little girl, Melanie Turner, goes to the principal's office with chest pains. So they call an ambulance and they take her to the Weiler Children's Hospital in Hyde Park, and she's actually pronounced dead for an apparent sickle cell crisis. At the time, the spokesman for the Midwest Association for Sickle Cell Anemia, Dr. Earl Frederick, told reporters that if a child is stressed enough, it is possible for an event, like the racial slurs and the taunting, could trigger an attack. And another cardiologist who we asked to remain anonymous told another reporter that the atmosphere outside of Stevenson, you know, was a trigger, and the disease obviously did the rest, in damaging the Turner's daughter. And Helen Turner, her mother, actually told Operation Push that her daughter's last words were "Go back, go back, to go back." And as word got around that Melanie Turner had passed away, there was people in Scottsdale chanting "Hooray for sickle cell!" And so this is one of the really saddest parts of this thing. How this 8-year-old girl became a victim of this, and I don't think anyone knows who she is. I certainly didn't, and I went to Stevenson, and she went to Stevenson. So it's something that we have to reckon with as a neighborhood and as a city. As time passes, so the news kind of as the protest essentially died down. The students are getting bused. Essentially, it becomes a very popular program. It's popular in the sense that people are actually participating. Students are getting bussed in. Uh, as I'm doing research, particularly in Stevenson and Bogan and other Ashburn schools, the kind of the reports start to die down. So I'm assuming that there it just becomes like an everyday thing, just of students getting bussed in. Essentially, the parents kind of loses the segregationist loses battle per se. Um, but by the 1980 by the late 1980s, there's an article that I found about Bogan kind of being this it's being highlighted as like this kind of miracle story because of the integration of white students, black students, Latino students in the late 80s and throughout the 90s. So it's very interesting what's happening in Scottsdale at this time because we start seeing Ashburn in general, not just Scottsdale, but the broader Ashburn neighborhood start experiencing white flight after the schools start integrating. So I'm not necessarily correlating, but there's a relationship there that maybe someone would can eventually study this. Um, but throughout the 70s and in the 80s and up into the 90s, essentially there's massive white flight. The neighborhoods become black families move in, Latino families move in, such as my family, start moving into the far southwest side of the neighborhood. And so these schools, um, because of the loss of white students, just essentially just are becoming integrated from black and brown families. But I think that would be an interesting story for the folks who are listening to this to look into what happened in the 80s and the 90s in Scottsdale. I think that's an important story that needs to be told to see how the city how the neighborhood just changed entirely from what it was to not what it is now.
You personally attended Stevenson Elementary in the late '90s, I believe. What was your experience like when you were there? What did the school look like?
Yeah, so I still remember, we moved in '97. I was entering the third grade um at Stevenson Elementary. And at the time I didn't speak English that well, so the luckily there was enough Latinos in the class where the teacher kind of like sat me down to other Latino students who could speak Spanish, and so I was enrolled in ESL classes, English as a second language classes. But by that time, was there was, at least from my recollection, it was just a very diverse school. I mean, my classroom was Latino students, black students. There was Arab students and white students, and the stories of what I read were completely different from what I saw at Stevenson, right? Um, I obviously did witness some type of racial incidents in the neighborhood growing up. With the park, or there were sometimes issues with kids who were going to private schools in the areas who would say things to us kind of public school students. But I kind of looked at them as like a private school versus public school kind of beef that happened. But there were racial undertones in some of those. Um, but I would say that now the neighborhood is completely different. The neighborhood is predominantly a Latino neighborhood. And I thought it was really important for me as a Latino, as a Mexican American, to be able to write this story, right? To write Black history and American history, because it's all part of the narrative of our country, right? The narrative of our city, and it's important for us to explore and grapple with those difficult conversations that are often ignored, that happened in the past, and we need to bring them up to light to now.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. So, like you said, you have strong family ties in Scottsdale and Ashburn today. How would you like people in the neighborhood to grapple with this history today, 45 years after the fact?
I think it'd be good for uh, schools like Stevenson, schools like Bogan, and the other schools in the area, Dawes. good academy and the other schools that are there. I think it'd be interesting for them to integrate this lesson, this particular article, into their lesson plans. For students to know. I mean, that this is happening. It's always good to understand our history. What happened, so we can grow from it and learn from the mistakes and learn and grow from here. Um, I think it'd also be important for the family of Malini Turner to get some type of apology, or something to help them, to provide a closure, right? Or an honorary, a commemoration, an honorary statement, for her death. Because it's something that we haven't grappled with. There has to be some type of recognition, for the neighborhood to know what happened. It's really important for folks to to understand how we've grown from this, right? And how we should not repeat what happened, in that summer of 1977.
Okay, I thought that was a really good interview with Ismail. I really appreciate him bringing this important and underappreciated story to light. Um, Jose, what were some of your main takeaways from the interview?
I mean, I just Ishmael's shock of uncovering this history of the neighborhood he grew up in and went to school around in, playing such a pivotal moment in national history, and him not knowing about it through his school, I thought was pretty jarring. And his article, had a lot of vivid moments, but the the one that stuck out to me was MLK, having seeing Chicagoans pelt rocks at him and trash and falling to his knees, and commenting that Chicago has it worse than the South in a lot of ways, and just that all hit really close to home for sure.
Yeah, definitely important to remember the history of Dr. King in Chicago, and when he was marching for housing integration. And obviously, housing and school integration are uh, intimately interconnected. So, but we think about the way that our neighborhoods have been built in Chicago and the way that segregation is kind of baked into everything. Um, but one of the things that we try to do with the collective, at least, is to encourage people in Southwest Side neighborhoods that can be sort of tucked away and sort of geographically isolated from one another, and like a lot of neighborhoods, sort of uh, ethnically and racially homogenous, to encourage these neighborhoods to make common cause with one another. Because the more we work together, the more we can achieve. And we do that within the Southwest Side, but certainly we'd encourage Southwest Side neighborhoods and the Southwest Side as a region, to make common cause with other neighborhoods across the city as a whole. Because again, the more that we work together, the more we can address some of the pressing issues that are that are affecting the city.
Definitely, the working class of the city definitely has more common cause with itself, than with a lot of the ruling elite. And it's jarring that Chicago's very racist, hyper micromanaged urban planning policies at the turn of the century is one of the reasons that we have such ethnic and cultural character to a lot of neighborhoods. And it's weird to see those dynamics persist in the fight to integrate schools. The late '70s, when this fight in Scottsdale is taking place, in a neighborhood like almost right next door to me. This is a fight that started in the '50s, but Chicago's policies, kind of made, had a meritocratic kind of critique of keeping these dynamics going. We see those dynamics repeat today. Schools continue to be a flashpoint for urban planning discussions and fights, such as vaccines and masks, and who gets to be remote ready and who doesn't. What does a professional education environment look like? and who gets to judge that? I always ask, to democratize our spaces, or and echo, and applaud the efforts of the collective, to break down barriers and make common cause across neighborhoods.